and she started crying. And the reason she started crying is she said something to the effect of, this group has made me feel worthy. I feel confident. I feel seen. And now I'm ready.
You're listening to the 7-Figure Leap podcast. We're here to leverage rich relationships and smart strategies to take your business to the next level. Here's your host, Dustin Riekman.
Welcome back to the 7-Figure Leap podcast. Today, I want to do a deep dive on another FAQ when it comes to marketing and specifically podcast guesting. And that is answering the question, will podcast guesting work for me if I'm an introvert? Right. And so there's actually a bit of controversy out there whether introvert and extrovert are really things. But I think in general, we all know whether we love to be around people and we're energized by that. We love to maybe speak extemporaneously and, kind of like be the life of the party. And then there's a lot of us who are more reserved, who maybe we consider ourselves shy and don't like to be put on the spot. And I think that being put on the spot is the feeling that a lot of people are relating to, and they say, I'm quote unquote an introvert, and therefore I'm not sure that this form of marketing and podcast guesting would work for me. So I want to use the time today to talk through a couple of examples of clients who I would say are super introverts and one who is not, however, has a related concern. And I'm going to talk through like the strategies they employed to be very successful in podcast guesting. And I want to give you a few quick tips, whether an introvert or an extrovert, on how you can prepare well for a podcast interview so you can be super confident and, come away feeling energized from the experience. So as we start this discussion, one thing I would love to reveal for you is that I'm a super introvert. So you may or may not know that. I've done a ton of podcast guesting. Obviously, I'm hosting a podcast. And I'm an introvert. I've spoken from stages. I've used to sell a lot at trade shows for our Fire Creek Snacks brand, which is a lot of sort of toe-to-toe personal interactions. And I'm an introvert, right? And so how do those things reconcile? Well, in those more public settings, I can turn it on, right? I can do it. I don't like to do it. And at the end of a long day of being on a trade show, for example, talking to strangers, I'm absolutely completely wiped out. Have to just basically crawl into a bed and try to recharge my batteries. So that is what an introvert is, right? An extrovert would actually get energy from being around other people. An introvert tends to that takes their energy. It doesn't mean they can't do it. So again, I don't know that that's actually the most pertinent part of this discussion. I think the part of this that people are associating with introversion or extroversion is actually the ability to have extemporaneous conversations. Okay, so first example I want to go through is a woman named Julie Bowl. She's one of my favorite clients. She's an amazingly talented woman. One of the few people who enrolled in our accelerator program because of an in-person encounter that I had with her husband at a faith group. And so as I got to know Julie, I was like, man, she's a really soulful, smart woman. And I found out that she did quite a bit of speaking, right? And so she seemed fairly comfortable standing in front of a room at a conference. She works with nonprofit organizations, and she would stand in front of these rooms and give workshops or give conference keynotes. A lot of her delivery was working with teams in like a boardroom doing strategic planning. So, it doesn't really come across as someone who's like afraid of talking or being in front of a small crowd. But we got into our program and we developed Julie's messaging and her story, and we wrote this amazing pitch to send to podcast. I was like, this is like going to be a home run. And a week went by and it was 10 days. I'm like, Julie, how's it going? Have you been sending these pitches? She's like, I'm sorry, I just can't. I'm like, what do you mean you just can't? She's like, I'm terrified. I'm like, how are you terrified? And she's like, well, I'm terrified because if I get on these shows, I have to have like an open-ended conversation. I'm not in control of the narrative. Like I don't get to pre-select exactly what I'm going to talk about. And I was like, oh, now I understand. And so we worked with Julie, coached her up, did some mock interviews. And of course, as you might expect, if you can go look her up on LinkedIn or elsewhere, she's absolutely amazing as a podcast guest, but she did have this fear. It turned out in her case, she had a childhood hearing issue. And I think that actually played into a lot of this, right? This whole idea of processing and thinking on your feet and being able to express audibly, what's going on whenever you've dealt with some childhood hearing or speech issues. That numerous clients actually in that camp. But the key was, let's get in some reps. Let's practice this. I think you're going to find that it's way more comfortable than you're making it out to be. And that was absolutely the case. And once she actually did this a few times, and we employed some of the strategies I want to talk about at the end of the session today, it worked great. But she would definitely tell you she's an introvert. She hates the idea of extemporaneous conversations and was very fearful of that. But also just crushed it. She's really, really done well. She would call herself a late bloomer, but once she got the podcast guesting machine rolling, it's really, really done amazing things for her business. The second person I want to highlight is Lachey Lewis. Lachey is actually a previous guest on this podcast. And so I won't go through her whole story, but what I want to share with Lachey is she came into our accelerator program and she was working 2 jobs. She wanted to have her own business. She was an amazing mom of 4 and like a very powerful woman. And this I like to emphasize because these are not exclusive things that we typically put people in categories. She's all those things and painfully shy, an introvert. And there was more, though, to Lachey's story. And she would tell you, I actually did a workshop with her for her audience last week. And part of what she shared was, in the accelerator, she learned all the tools, like she got the pitches and the messaging, and she knew how to be interviewed well. Of course, we developed her business and her offers and all the things that she went on to grow a $30,000, $40,000 a month recurring revenue consulting business. Like, that's been awesome. But there was a pivotal moment in a meeting that she recalled to me that she came to the meeting. We were talking about wins of the week, and she started crying. And the reason she started crying is she said something to the effect of, this group has made me feel worthy. I feel confident. I feel seen. And now I'm ready. Okay. So like, that's powerful. I was crying. Many people were crying. And it wasn't about the mechanics of interview skills or thinking on your feet. It was self-belief. And I think that's the other big thing that people lack sometimes is like, am I worthy for this microphone? Am I worthy for this opportunity in this stage? And so a lot of what we love to help people do is get clarity and confidence. And confidence comes from clarity, right? And so they're very much intertwined. And so if you can get more clear on who you're serving, why it's a passion of yours, and the stories that support that, that helps a lot with this fear that can otherwise come up. So again, once Lachey got past that fear, like 2 weeks later, she had booked Exit 5, huge podcast opportunity. And if you listen to our interview, you'll find out it was the inflection point of her whole business career. And it was fun to update last week. Because when we did the interview, I think she was at 20,000. Last week, she's at 40,000 monthly recurring revenue from her solo business. And it's almost entirely fueled with podcast guesting. And it's amazing to think that, last year, Lachey was too scared to get behind a mic. And I say that with all the love in the world. It wasn't that she deserved to be scared. It was just that she didn't have that self-belief. And getting in a tight-knit community of people who could reflect back to her expertise, her genius, how special she is, and how people needed her message, it empowered her to do it. And I think that's a key theme you're going to hear here with Julie. You hear it with Lachey and with my next story with Mike. Doing it and pushing past the fear and having the support, the coach, the community to support you in that, and having the tools to make that as easy as possible is extremely powerful, because once you break through it, it's way easier to keep going because you faced it, right? You faced it and you realize that it's actually great. Third one, last one real quick. Mike Pacquione, not an introvert. He actually seems to me like quite an extrovert. Ironically, his entire business is based on speech writing, and he helps people stand on stage and deliver a signature keynote presentation. And he does that himself. Yet, he had an opportunity to be on Amy Porterfield's podcast. And, I think in his words, he was a little freaked out, kind of lost his whole mojo about like, what should I talk about? How do I introduce myself? What should we have for a call to action, a lead magnet? So I did some private consultations with him and prepped him for that. And the reason I bring Mike up is, again, not an introvert, someone who's actually a professional speaker, freaked out because he was, one, on a podcast, which was a free form content, and two, obviously is a big opportunity, a big platform. He did not want to mess it up, and he wanted to leverage it, as he should. But he and I use tools that I'm going to go through now that are the same for me, for Lachey, for Julie, and for Mike. And so these are basically simple preparation tools. First, I would say, is the mindset. So keep in mind, I think one of the beautiful things about podcast guesting is it's literally a one-on-one conversation. So you're literally going to get on with another human who wants you to look good, who's trying to make you as valuable as possible to their audience. They're going to frame you up in a positive light. Things can get edited out if things go wrong. like you're on the same team. And it's a one-on-one conversation. Now, eventually, hopefully hundreds of thousands of people will hear this. But in that moment, don't worry about all that. Just be like, hey, I'm here. We're on Riverside, Zencastr, Zoom. We're having a one-on-one conversation. And we both want this to go well. I think that's a huge thing. And then the second thing I'll share are some practical preparation tips. And talking about what I did with Mike, the thing I love to do is begin with the end in mind. So where are you going to call people to action at the end of the interview? And we'll use that to kind of go back through the structure of what stories you want to tell, how you want to introduce yourself and stuff like that. That's a little more of an advanced strategy. Maybe we'll do another episode on how to craft the perfect call to action. But I think once you're comfortable with that, everything else becomes easier. But even if you forget that, even if you didn't have a call to action, and this is your first couple interviews, here's how you prepare to have maximum confidence. Number one, listen to, I'd say, 2 of the most recent interviews on that show. And you really only need to listen to like the first 5 minutes and the last 5 minutes of the episode if you're crunched for time. Now, if you're new to this and you want to get a deeper feel for the host and all that, you can definitely listen to the full episodes. But the first 5 and the last 5 minutes are important because you'll hear how you're going to be introduced, and you'll hear at the end how they're going to close the show. Is there a lightning round of questions? Do they always ask everyone the same question, right? You definitely want to know that going into the opportunity. Number 2, practice your introduction. Okay. If you don't really have like a good introduction, it's like, hey, Dustin, welcome to the show. Tell us about yourself, right? That's very common. Use this really simple formula: problem, solution, benefit. Okay. Problem, solution, benefit. So what problem do you solve? How do you solve it? And what's the benefit? In like one line. So StoryBrand calls this a one-liner. It's actually 2 lines typically, but like, hey, Dustin, introduce yourself. Here's a really rough one. Hey, you may know that most people who do coaching and consulting or selling high ticket offers, pretty much their whole business becomes dependent on referrals. And that's a huge risk. I run a program called the Podcast Profits Accelerator, where I help these experts use podcast guesting so they can teach and do the things they already love to do and generate consistent leads so they're no longer dependent on referrals. What that does is tell you what I'm an expert at, introduces me without even saying my name. And most of all, it leads with the problem that if my target audience is listening, they're going to lean into that problem. So again, we could do a whole episode on introductions, but get an introduction down and practice it in the mirror. Okay. So, because once you introduce yourself well on a show and that goes smoothly, it just eases the blood pressure. Everything feels cool from there, and it's way more smooth. So, introduction, and practice that. At the end, know your call to action. So, you're going to send someone to a website, send someone to a freebie, that sort of thing, and have a very clear practice of that. So, if it's sevenfigureleap.com/playbook, like let that roll off your tongue and just be used to saying it. And then in the middle, part of this whole process, we use the 5P method, is when we actually pitch to the host why we want to be on, we're going to give them a bullet point summary of the things we love to talk about and teach. So in almost all cases, we're controlling the conversation, right? They will still ask individual questions, but in general, they're going to stay within our area of expertise that we've already told them about. So you control the middle of the interview in large part. But if you want to practice that sort of extemporaneous conversation, have a friend and do a mock interview. If you're in our program, we do mock interviews all the time with our clients. You can even do it with ChatGPT. You can have a virtual partner. But the idea is like, let someone ask you questions, learn how to listen well and respond clearly, and learn just kind of that dance or that dynamics of reading when people are ready for you to respond and things like that. And you'll get way better with this at practice. And then the final thing here, so introduction, know what you want to talk about in the middle of the interview, which you're going to basically have predefined in most cases if you follow our process, and then have a clear call to action. What I love to do as a tool, I call it the magic Post-it note. I literally write the host name and how to pronounce it, any stories or bullet points I want to make sure I'm able to share, any lightning round questions they might ask at the end, and then my call to action. And I literally write that by hand on a Post-it note. It goes on my computer. And when it comes time to do the interview, I'm set, right? Like I have confidence, a security blanket, and I can look at it and know, hey, I'm okay. I've got these topics. We're going to be all good. And again, just keep that mindset that it's a one-on-one conversation. The host wants you to look good, and you're going to look good. You're going to do great. So if you need help with this, that's what we do. We not only help you with the skills of interviewing well and preparing well and having full confidence, but like Lachey, we really elevate your mindset. And like Julie, We help you use this as a repeatable marketing system. And like Mike, we really help you take this to the next level where he's generated over 6 figures of revenue from one appearance. That's what we do at the Podcast Profits Accelerator. So if that's something you're interested in learning more about, definitely reach out to us. Just go to sevenfigureleap.com. You'll see a big button right there to book a call with me or our team. We'd love to talk to you about this. But I hope today has been super helpful, especially if you feel like you're in the introvert camp and you're not sure that podcast interviews are the right channel for you. I hope that you realize now you can totally do this and you will crush it and you'll actually have a ton of fun in the process.